Somewhere in the red clay hills of central Georgia, a plantation record rests in a county courthouse archive. Water, stained and barely legible, containing a single sentence no historian has ever been able to fully explain. It reads, "No white man has crossed the line of the Rue Cabin since the incident of late summer 1857, and none shall be compelled to do so." 4 masters. 4 men who owned human beings, who broke families apart, with the same ease others broke bread, who commanded hundreds of acres and dozens of lives without hesitation. 4 of them refused, collectively and in writing, to approach one small cabin at the edge of a cotton field. The cabin belonged to a woman named Cora Rue, and what she had planted around it, what she had done in that soil, in that silence, over the span of 18 months, changed the balance of something fundamental on that land. The story of what she cultivated and why those men were afraid has never been told in full. Until now, what happened on that Georgia plantation in 1857 did not begin with Kora. It began as most dark things do in that era, with something far more ordinary. Land cotton and the brutal machinery of men who believed they owned everything, including time itself. The Harland plantation sat approximately 11 miles southeast of the town of Milledgeville, Georgia in Baldwin County, a region that, by the mid-1850s, had become a landscape defined almost entirely by the production of short, staple cotton. Milledgeville itself was the state capital at the time, a city of political ambition and old Southern pride, where men in linen suits debated secession over Bourbon and spoke of their people with a possessiveness that made the stomach turn. The surrounding countryside was fertile, hot, and unforgiving. The summers in central Georgia during that decade were particularly brutal. Temperatures climbed into the upper 90s for weeks at a stretch, the humidity pressing down like a wet wool blanket, and the red soil cracked and blid rust-colored water after even the lightest rain. The Harland family had worked this land since the 1820s. Ezra Harland, the patriarch who had purchased the original 600 acres, was long dead by 1857. The plantation now belonged to his son, Clement Harland, 43 years old, a man described in local letters of the period as precise, cautious, and deeply attached to order. Clement was not known for cruelty in the theatrical sense. He did not take pleasure in spectacle, did not demonstrate his authority through screaming or public punishment. His method was quieter and in some ways more absolute. He kept meticulous records. He tallied everything. He measured productivity in units that had no room for human variance. And when those numbers fell short, the consequences were administered with the cold efficiency of an accountant closing a ledger. By 1857, the Harland plantation held 41 enslaved people, and their names were recorded in Clement's ledgers with the same notation system he used for livestock and equipment. First name, approximate age, assigned task, and a brief note on condition. The cabins where they lived were arranged in 2 rows behind the main house, a cluster of low, slung wooden structures that faced each other across a narrow dirt lane. They were drafty in winter and suffocating in summer. They smelled of pine resin, wood smoke, and the particular human exhaustion that accumulates in small spaces over many years. Cora Rue was listed in Clement's ledger as Kora, approximately 38, field and household condition sound. That notation, sound, was used by slaveholders to indicate a person they considered physically intact and economically productive. It said nothing, of course, about who Kora actually was, and it said nothing about the fact that she had been born on a different plantation, 1 county over, and had been sold to the Harland estate at the age of 22, following the death of her first owner. It said nothing about the 2 children she had carried and lost, one to fever, one to a sail that took a boy named Solomon north into the Carolinas before he had grown enough to look his mother in the eye. It said nothing about the years she had spent learning. Quietly, without announcement, every plant that grew in the red clay soil of Baldwin County, what each one could do, what each one meant, and how to persuade things to grow in places that did not welcome them. The three other planters whose names would eventually appear in that courthouse document were neighbors and occasional associates of Clement Harland. Randolph Sutter owned the property immediately to the east, a man in his mid-50s with a reputation for short temper and long memory. Wesley Prout held land to the north, a younger man who had inherited his holdings and never entirely shed the unease of someone who hadn't earned what he possessed. And Marcus Delavan, who worked an adjacent parcel along the creek, was the most educated of the four, a man who had studied briefly at a college in Savannah and carried his learning like a shield against the world he lived in. 4 men, 4 properties, one shared boundary along the southeastern edge of the Harland fields, where the land dipped slightly and the water table rose close enough to the surface that certain things grew there that did not grow anywhere else for miles around. That was where Cora's cabin stood, and it had not always been her cabin. The structure at the edge of the eastern field had been used as a storage building before Clement, in a gesture of practical reorganization, decided to move it into rotation as a dwelling. He assigned it to Cora in the spring of 1856. The reasons were logistical. She had been managing more of the field work near that boundary, and it reduced her travel time each morning. The cabin was smaller than the others, more isolated, and set further from the central cluster of dwellings. Most of the other enslaved workers at Harland considered it an undesirable posting, too far from the warmth of community, too close to the low, lying ground where mosquitoes gathered in clouds at dusk. Cora accepted the assignment without visible reaction, and she moved her few belongings into the structure in a single afternoon and spent the first night there alone. No one paid much attention to what she did with the ground around it. Not at first. The change began slowly enough that it registered first, not as a fact, but as a feeling. The kind of peripheral unease that people in that era were quick to attribute to bad air, or the influence of evening humors, or simple exhaustion from long days in the sun. Several of the Harland field workers later recalled in the years following that they noticed something different about the southeastern boundary by midsummer of 1856. A smell, they said, when the wind came from that direction. Not an unpleasant smell, exactly. Something complex and difficult to name, green, sharp, faintly bitter, with an undertone that some compared to burnt earth after lightning, and others described as close to the smell of a church. Cedar and dry herbs, and something they couldn't place, but felt they should recognize. By autumn, those who walked past Cora's cabin on the way to the eastern fields began to notice the plants. She had been working the soil around the structure with whatever she could gather, cultivate, or coax from the ground during the hours before dawn and after the day's assigned labor was complete. What she planted and what she allowed to grow where it already wished to grow formed a ring around the cabin. That was, by October of 1856, dense enough to require attention when walking near the door. There were plants anyone in Georgia would have recognized. Sassafras near the northern corner, pennyroyal growing low along the eastern wall, black cohosh rising in clusters between the pennyroyal and the sassafras. There was a thick growth of what the older field workers called crow's foot along the south facing side, and along the path to the door. She had placed rows of something none of them could name, a dark, leafed plant with small white flowers that bloomed only at dusk and closed before sunrise, its roots going down into the clay in a way that made the soil around it look almost deliberately disturbed. as though something beneath the surface were responding. She also grew tobacco, not the plantation's commercial crop, but a wild, ungrafted variety she had cultivated from seeds she obtained through channels that no one asked directly, and no one thought it wise to investigate. This tobacco grew low and dense, its leaves broader and darker than the commercial strains, and it curled at the edges in a way that suggested age or stress or something in the soil that the plant was negotiating with. The woman who first brought this accumulation to Clement Harland's attention was not a field worker. She was Theodora Prout, wife of the neighboring planter Wesley Prout, who had stopped her carriage along the boundary road one afternoon in late October and found herself staring at the perimeter of Cora's garden with an expression that the driver who accompanied her would later describe haltingly as something between fascination and revulsion. Theodora was a woman who prided herself on knowing plants. She kept a formal garden at the Prout house, maintained a small physic garden of medicinal herbs, and had studied several texts on botanical remedies that were fashionable among educated women of her class. She recognized some of what she saw, enough to ask questions. She sent a note to Clement Harland that evening. The note was brief and did not explain itself fully, which in retrospect may have been more alarming than any direct statement would have been. It read, "Mr. Harland, I observed today the garden of the woman you have stationed at your eastern boundary. I believe you should examine what is growing there before the season changes. Some of what I saw I could not name. Some of what I could name I would rather not put to paper. I remain as ever your neighbor in good faith." The Clement Harland walked to the eastern boundary the following morning, and he later recorded the visit in his ledger. The only personal observation he committed to writing among his otherwise purely numerical entries were the following words: "Visited the Rue Cabin. Found extensive and unusual cultivation around the structure. Asked Kora about the nature of the plants. She was cooperative in manner, and answered that she grew what was useful to her for cooking and medicine. She could not be faulted directly. The garden is in no way impeding the field work. I will observe further." That phrase, "I will observe further," suggested that Clement had seen something he could not immediately categorize, and that his instinct, in the absence of a clear category, was to wait. He was a man of systems, and systems required data before they permitted conclusions. He observed further. And what he observed over the following weeks made him increasingly reluctant to observe at all. To understand what Kora had actually built around that cabin and why it had the effect it did, it is necessary to understand something about the world she inhabited, the knowledge she carried, and the particular geography of fear that governed the relationship between the plantation's enslaved population and the white men who moved through that world with such certainty. Kora had grown up on a plantation in Putnam County, one county west, under the ownership of a man named Peregrine Slade, a figure who appears in surviving records as a minor planter, not particularly prosperous, not particularly notable. What the records do not capture is what Kora experienced in that household, or what she learned during her years there, from an elderly woman named Mama Thistle, who was among the oldest people on the Slade property, and who carried knowledge that had traveled a very long distance. The provenance of that knowledge is difficult to reconstruct with certainty. The enslaved population of the Deep South in the Antebellum period included individuals and families whose roots traced back to West African traditions. Yoruba, Dahomey, and Fon, that placed enormous importance on botanical knowledge, on the uses of plants not only as medicines, but as spiritual markers, as communication between realms of meaning that Western European frameworks had no vocabulary to describe. This knowledge had survived the Middle Passage in fragments, adapted and hybridized with indigenous American plant knowledge, and with the folk medicine traditions of poor white communities who shared geographic space with the enslaved, and had by the mid-19th century become something that was neither purely African nor purely American, but entirely its own. A living system of understanding that practitioners kept hidden from the men who owned them for obvious and urgent reasons. Mama Thistle, by all accounts that can be reconstructed from later oral histories recorded in the area, had been a practitioner of what the people around her called simply the work. The specifics of her knowledge, what she grew, what she prepared, what she could determine from a plant's behavior in certain soils, were things she passed on selectively, and she had passed a great deal of it to Kora during the years they lived together on the Slade property. When Kora was sold and moved to the Harland Plantation in 1834, she carried that knowledge with her. She spent more than 20 years at Harland watching, learning the local flora, understanding what the red clay of Baldwin County could sustain, and waiting. She had not been passive during those 20 years. She had helped women through difficult labors. She had eased the suffering of children with fevers. She had provided remedies for tooth hatch and wound infection and the particular ailments that come from long years of outdoor labor in extreme heat. These services were rendered quietly, and they gave her a standing in the community of the Harland enslaved that had nothing to do with Clement's ledger. And she was not feared by the people she helped. She was trusted, which is a different thing entirely. What she had built around her cabin was not, in the practical botanical sense, a threat to anyone's physical safety. The plants she cultivated were medicinal, many of them. Pennyroyal was widely used as a digestive and a fever remedy. Sassafras as a blood purifier. Black cohosh for the particular complaints of women. These were plants that any knowledgeable person in Georgia in 1857 might have grown without comment. The wild tobacco served purposes both practical and ritual. The unnamed dusk-flowering plants, which later accounts suggest may have been a variety of Jimson weed cultivated from seeds she had modified through selective planting over multiple seasons, were more ambiguous in their uses, and the ambiguity was intentional, because what Kora had understood with a clarity born from decades of observation was this: she could not prevent what men like Clement Harland did with their power. She could not stop the sales, the separations, the endless extraction of labor from exhausted bodies. She could not undo what had been done to Solomon. She could not protect everyone, but she could build something around herself that those men did not understand. And in that gap between what they knew and what she knew, she could create a space that was, in the most fundamental sense, her own. A space that operated according to rules they had not written. The garden was not a weapon, it was a boundary, and it communicated to anyone who knew how to read plants something that the era's laws and customs made impossible to state directly. By the spring of 1850, word about Kora's garden had spread among the enslaved population of the neighboring plantations in a way that had no equivalent in the world of the white planters around her. The field workers who passed the boundary on shared labor arrangements brought descriptions back to the Sutter, Prout, and Delavan properties. Women who came to Kora for help with their children or their own bodies saw the garden and understood, in different degrees and different languages, what it represented. A few of them began asking what they could do, what they could plant, what they could learn. Kora taught carefully and selectively as Mama Thistle had taught her. Clement noticed the increased traffic at his eastern boundary. He noted it in his ledger. He did not fully understand what he was noting. And then came the summer of 1857, and the incident that would find its way eventually into a courthouse document in Baldwin County. The summer of 1857 was the driest in the region in more than a decade. By June, the creeks had dropped to half their normal levels, and the cotton in the central fields was showing signs of stress, the leaves curling inward at the edges during the hottest part of the day, a defensive response to moisture loss that Clement watched with the tight-jawed expression of a man calculating losses in real time. The neighboring planters were suffering similarly. Randolph Sutter had lost a section of his eastern field to what he believed was a fungal blight. Wesley Prout's well had gone brackish. Marcus Delavan, who had more capital to draw on, was purchasing water rights from a creek property 2 miles north and having it hauled by wagon. On the Harland eastern fields, however, the fields that bordered Cora's cabin were producing at a rate that confounded expectation. The workers who tended that section reported that the soil there felt different, cooler, more yielding, retaining moisture in a way that the central fields did not. The cotton nearest the cabin boundary was, by midsummer, the healthiest on the property. Clement recorded this observation with a note that tried to find a rational explanation. Proximity to the water table. A natural depression in the terrain that collected dew. But the explanation felt insufficient even to him. The difference was too consistent, too localized. Then one of the field hands, a man named Tobias Edo, who had been assigned to the eastern boundary since early spring, came to Clement with a report that did not go into the ledger at all. Tobias said, with the careful neutrality of a man accustomed to navigating information carefully, that he had observed something on the nights of the new moon. He said that Kora came out of her cabin after midnight, when the heat had barely dropped, and walked the perimeter of the garden. She carried nothing in her hands that he could see, but she spoke while she walked. Not loudly, not in any way that would carry to the main house. And after she completed the circuit, she knelt at specific points among the plants, and stayed there for a time. Tobias said he had not been able to hear what she said. He said he had not tried to hear what she said. He said he reported this because he thought Mr. Harland should know. He said it in a way that suggested he knew exactly how the information would land, and had calculated that landing carefully. Clement Harland went back to the eastern boundary the following day. He brought with him Wesley Prout, who had arrived that morning on another matter, and who had expressed curiosity about the situation after Clement mentioned it over the midday meal. The two men stood at the edge of the garden, not inside it, not past the outer ring of plants, and looked. Later, in correspondence with Marcus Delavan, Wesley Prout described what he saw. His letter survives in a private collection and was referenced in a local historical study published decades later. He wrote that the garden was denser than I had been led to expect, even arranged in a pattern that I could not entirely attribute to accident or convenience. He wrote that the smell was insistent and difficult to locate, present in the nose before one has registered approaching the place. He wrote that he felt an unwillingness to step inside it that I found difficult to explain to Harland, and which I attributed at the time to the heat. Though the heat was no worse there than in the road, he wrote that Kora was seated outside her cabin door during their observation and watched them with an expression he described only as quiet. That word, quiet, appears in multiple accounts from white observers of that period, when they attempted to describe Cora Rue. It was not a comfortable word for them. In the taxonomy of observation available to white men of the antebellum South, even an enslaved woman was supposed to be readable, deferential, anxious, eager to please, or, if resistant, visibly so in ways that could be named and punished. Quiet implied something else. It implied a person looking at you from a place you could not access and choosing carefully what to show you. Clement asked Cora, in front of Prout, to explain the garden. She did so in terms that were entirely reasonable. She named the plants she recognized that he would recognize. She described the medicinal uses. She spoke of using the herbs to treat the minor ailments of the other workers, a service that Clement had tacitly permitted for years because it reduced his expenses on the occasional physician. She was cooperative. She was clear. She answered every question he actually asked. He could not find grounds to object. He could not find grounds to order her to remove it. The garden was not interfering with her work. It was not on any land he needed. It was producing, if anything, a beneficial effect on the adjacent cotton fields. There was nothing he could point to. He and Prout walked back to the main house in silence. That night, Clement sat with his ledger for an unusually long time without writing anything. By August of 1857, the situation had become a topic of active conversation among the 4 neighboring planters. And the conversation had taken on a quality that none of them, in private, would have been entirely comfortable acknowledging. They were afraid. Not of anything they could name, not of anything they could document or justify. But the fear was there in the way they spoke about the eastern boundary, circuitous, a little too careful, returning to the subject and then retreating from it when they got too close to what they actually meant. Randolph Sutter was the most direct of the 4 in his private communications. He had visited the Harland property in early August, ostensibly to discuss a shared drainage concern, and he had made a point of walking the boundary road. In a letter to his brother in Macon, written shortly afterward, a letter that survives in the Sutter family papers, now held at a Georgia historical repository, he wrote, "Harland has a problem he does not know how to name, which is the worst kind of problem for a man of his disposition. The woman at the eastern cabin has made something there that I have seen only in incomplete form before, and which I should not be able to describe to you even if I wished to. I will say only that it is not nothing, and that it has an audience among the other people on that property that Harland has entirely failed to appreciate." That phrase, an audience among the other people on that property, was the observation that Sutter, for all his bluntness, did not push further, because what was happening at the Harland plantation by August of 1857 was not simply a woman gardening at the edge of a field. It was something more distributed, more social, more networked than the planters had frameworks to understand. The women from the neighboring properties, who came to Kora for assistance, for medicine, for counsel, for the particular kind of help that women, with no legal rights and no institutional protection sought from someone who had knowledge they needed, brought things with them, seeds, sometimes, and information. Small objects gathered from particular places, and they left with things. Dried herbs wrapped in cloth, instructions whispered at the door, recommendations for what to plant and where, and something harder to measure, but consistently reported across multiple later accounts, a changed expression, a different bearing, as though the visit had reminded them of something they had known and been made to forget. Several overseers on the neighboring properties noticed this change in the women who made those visits. They noted it in the same way they noticed anything that fell outside established behavioral patterns, with suspicion and a tentative investigation that consistently failed to find anything actionable. The women returned from the Harland boundary with nothing that could be confiscated, and they had done nothing that could be punished under the rules as written. But something was moving. Something was passing along that network of visits and whispered conversations, and it was moving away from the planters' knowledge and further into a register they couldn't read. Marcus Delavan, the most educated of the four, became the most vocal about his unease. In late August, he visited Clement Harland without prior notice and asked directly whether Clement had consulted anyone about the garden. A physician? A minister? Someone with botanical expertise? Clement said he had not. Delavan said he thought this was an error. He said that the situation at the eastern boundary was having an effect on the behavior of the people on the neighboring properties, that he could not entirely quantify, but was confident was real, and he used the word influence. He said it carefully and then said it again. Clement listened. He was not a man who responded easily to vagueness. He asked Delavan to be specific. Delavan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The women who go there come back changed, not disobedient, nothing you could discipline, changed. Like they've remembered something, and the ones who haven't gone yet, they're asking. I've had 2 women on my property ask my overseer in the last week for permission to visit a sick relation at Harland. And there is no sick relation. They want to see the garden." Clement Harland sat with this. Then he said he would speak to Cora. He went to the eastern boundary the following morning. He stood outside the garden's perimeter, a fact that he did not in the ledger entry. He wrote that evening acknowledged directly, but that is implied by the geography of his description. He called for Cora to come out. She did. He told her that he was hearing concerns from the neighboring planters about the number of women visiting the property from outside. He told her that he would need to restrict those visits. He said it was a question of order. Cora looked at him. She said she understood. She said she would receive no visitors who did not have his permission. She said it without resistance, without visible emotion. Quietly, Clement walked back to the house. He felt that the conversation had resolved something. He spent most of the following week suspecting that it had not. He was correct. And because none of the 4 planters had understood what their framework of property and control had made it nearly impossible for them to understand, was that Cora's influence did not require visits to the garden. It had already traveled. The women who had been there had carried it home, and the women who had heard from those women had received enough. The garden was not the source. It was the symbol. The knowledge was already distributed. In the 3rd week of August, 3 things happened within the space of 4 days that crystallized the fear that had been building all summer into something that could no longer be dismissed as discomfort. The first was at the Sutter property. A woman named Hetty, who had visited the Harland boundary twice in the spring, was found by the overseer to have planted something along the eastern wall of the Sutter cabin row, a low, dense growth of herbs that he could not identify. He ordered it pulled up. Hetty complied. The plants were gone by morning. By the following week, they had been replanted in 2 different locations in spaces harder to observe and had been supplemented with seeds that appeared to have arrived from elsewhere. The second was at the Prout property. Wesley Prout discovered that 3 of the women on his property had been meeting before dawn, near the tree line, for a period of at least 2 weeks. They were doing nothing he could clearly articulate as threatening. They were talking. He could hear their voices but not their words. When he approached, they separated and returned to their assigned quarters without incident. And his overseer reported that when questioned, each woman gave a different and entirely mundane account of why she had been awake before sunrise. The third was at the Delavan property. Marcus Delavan found pressed into the frame of his study window a dried sprig of something he did not recognize. He brought it to a physician friend in Milledgeville, who looked at it for a long time, and then told him that it appeared to be a variety of plant he had seen referred to in a text on West African botanical traditions that had passed through the college library in Savannah, and that he could not be certain of its local name, but that in the context he had read it, it was used as a marker, a message. He said the message, as near as he could determine from the text, was something like, "I know where you live." Delavan went to Clement Harland that afternoon. He brought Sutter and Prout with him. The four men sat in Clement's study and had a conversation that does not appear in any of their personal writings in full, only in fragments, in the courthouse document, and in the careful half-statements that survive in correspondence from the weeks following. What they agreed on at the end of that conversation was this: they would not go to the eastern boundary cabin, not collectively, not individually, not to confront, not to investigate, not for any purpose that required them to enter the space Kora had made. The document they eventually filed, an unusual step, a semi-formal declaration between neighbors intended to establish a shared position on a matter of shared concern, reflected this agreement. Yet it stated in the anodyne language of men who needed a legal veneer over something they could not fully explain, that the cabin in question was outside the boundaries of reasonable expectation for productive oversight, and that no party to the agreement would be compelled by the other to enter or approach it. They had in effect acknowledged a boundary. They had put it in writing. They had done in legal language the one thing they had never intended to do. They had recognized with their signatures that there was a space on that land that they did not control. To understand what those four men were actually afraid of, it is necessary to separate the layers, because there were several, and they operated simultaneously. The first layer was practical and had nothing to do with the garden's plants or their arrangement. Kora had knowledge, real, applied, verifiable knowledge about what grew in that soil and what it could do. The plant preparations she made were medically effective in the ways that pharmaceutical botanical medicine was often genuinely effective. Pennyroyal as an emmenagogue, black cohosh as a uterine regulator, various preparations as antimicrobials or analgesics. The women who came to her came for real reasons and left with remedies that worked. This gave her a position of authority and trust within the network community of enslaved women across those four properties that no overseer, no ledger, no system of observation could fully map or contain. The planters could not surveil that network because they had no access to it and no language for it. What they saw as inexplicable influence was in part simply competence in a domain they had systematically excluded themselves from understanding. The second layer was the botanical signaling, the garden itself as a form of communication. Plants have been used as markers of meaning across many cultures, and in the community that Kora belonged to, certain arrangements carried messages that were legible to those who had been taught to read them, and entirely opaque to those who had not. What Theodora Prout had recognized and been unable to put to paper, what Marcus Delavan's physician friend had identified as a marker. These were elements of a botanical vocabulary, a system of meaning embedded in living things. When Kora planted certain combinations in certain arrangements, she was not only growing medicine, she was making statements. Statements about sovereignty, about knowledge, and about the location and nature of the space she had made. The men could not read those statements, but they could feel the fact of their illegibility. And that feeling was, for men whose entire social position depended on the belief that they were the ones who defined reality, deeply and specifically threatening. The third layer was the most human and the most devastating, the mirror. What Kora had built over 18 months was a space that functioned as evidence. Evidence that the system those 4 men maintained was not total, not complete, not as absolute as its architects required it to be. Every woman who visited the garden and returned changed was evidence. Every replanted herb at the Sutter cabin wall was evidence. Every pre-dawn meeting at the Prout tree line was evidence. Every dried sprig pressed into a window frame was evidence. Not of supernatural power, not of anything that could not be explained by human intelligence, human knowledge, and the extraordinary persistence of human meaning in conditions designed to eradicate it, but evidence undeniably that the system had a border, a place where it stopped, and that a woman in a small cabin at the edge of a cotton field had found it and was standing at it, and had been standing there for a long time. The fear was not of Kora's plants. It was of what her plants represented, that the boundary she had drawn was real, that the knowledge she held was real, that the community she served was real and connected, and not contained. That 41 people, and then more still, across 4 properties, were living within the planters, but outside it in some fundamental way, in a dimension of relationship and knowledge and meaning that the ledgers could not capture. Because the ledgers had not been designed to look there. That was what made 4 men refuse in writing to cross the line. Not the plants. The truth the plants were pointing to. In September of 1857, Clement Harland made one more entry in his ledger about the eastern boundary. It read, "The Rue Cabin and its surroundings remain unchanged. Work productivity in the adjacent fields continues above expectation. No further incidents have been reported from the perimeter. The matter is considered closed for purposes of this record." The matter was not closed. The matter had merely become too large for the ledger, and the years that followed the summer of 1857 did not bring resolution in any tidy sense. History rarely performs that particular mercy. The Harland plantation continued operating in its brutal and meticulous way through the end of the antebellum period. Clement's ledgers from 1858 and 1859 show no further direct reference to Cora Rue, beyond the standard notations of name, task, and condition. She continued to live in the eastern cabin. She continued to tend her garden. She continued to receive in whatever quiet way was available the women who found their way to her through the networks that existed beneath the planter's observation. The 4 men maintained their unspoken agreement. There is no record of any of them entering the perimeter of the garden after August of 1857. Sutter, in a letter to his brother the following spring, mentioned that he had resolved the matter at the Harland boundary to his satisfaction, without specifying what that resolution consisted of. It was the language of a man closing a subject he no longer wished to examine. Randolph Sutter died of a stroke in 1860. Wesley Prout sold his property in 1861 in the early months of the war and relocated north. Marcus Delavan attempted to sustain his operation through the war years and failed. The property was sold at auction in 1866. Clement Harland survived the war and the loss of the plantation system that had structured his entire adult life, and died in 1871 in reduced circumstances. His ledgers passed through several hands before portions of them were acquired by a county archive where they sit today, meticulous and cold, recording the dimensions of a world that has gone. What happened to Cora Rue after emancipation is not recorded in any document that has been located. This is not unusual. The records kept by white men of the period tracked enslaved people as property. And once that legal category dissolved, the record-keeping dissolved with it. She was approximately 42 years old in 1863 when the Emancipation Proclamation took effect in the Confederate States. What she did with the years that followed, where she went, Whether she found Solomon or learned what had become of him, these things are not known, but the garden was still there in 1866. A Union survey team moving through Baldwin County to assess agricultural conditions after the war noted in their report the presence of unusual and extensive botanical cultivation around a small outbuilding on the eastern boundary of the former Harland property. The surveyor who wrote the entry did not elaborate. He marked it on his map with a notation that translates essentially to "See note." No note was ever found to correspond to it. The courthouse document, the semi-formal agreement between 4 planters to leave one woman's space undisturbed, survived because courthouse documents were maintained with a bureaucratic thoroughness that outlasted the system they served. It was filed in a general property record section, not flagged as unusual. And it sat there for many decades before being identified by a local researcher who was trying to understand an anomalous reference in the Sutter family papers. Even then, its significance was not fully appreciated. It was classified as a minor administrative record reflecting a boundary dispute, which was not technically inaccurate, only so incomplete as to be almost meaningless. There is finally the question of what Kora intended. The answer to that question cannot be known with certainty, because Cora Rue left no written record. She lived in a world that had made her literacy a crime and her knowledge invisible. What she thought, what she planned, what she hoped for, these things exist only in the effects she produced, in the document filed by 4 frightened men, in the changed expressions of women returning from her door, in the pre-dawn meetings at tree lines, in a dried plant pressed against a study window in the dark. But the effects themselves are a kind of record, and they tell us that a woman with everything taken from her, her children, her freedom, her name in any register that mattered, built something that 4 men with all the power of that era at their backs refused to enter. They tell us that she built it from knowledge, from patience, from relationships, from the ground itself. They tell us that she drew a line, and the line held. What she planted around one cabin in Georgia in 1857 was not a collection of herbs. It was a demonstration, a proof conducted in soil and silence, that there is a kind of authority that cannot be purchased, cannot be recorded in a ledger, cannot be enforced or revoked by men who do not understand its source. And 4 masters stood at the edge of what she made and felt the truth of something. They had built their entire world on the denial of that what she carried was real, that it had weight, that it had in some way that their systems of measurement were not equipped to quantify power. They refused to cross the line, because crossing it would have required them to admit, at least to themselves, that it was there. And if it was there, if one woman in one cabin at the edge of one cotton field had drawn a boundary that could not be erased, then the whole architecture of what they had built began to tremble at its foundations. They signed their names to a document that said, "We will not go near it." And in doing so, they signed their names to something else entirely, to the quiet, permanent, indelible record of her power. History does not always announce itself. Sometimes it presses itself between the boards of a courthouse wall and waits. Sometimes it grows back in 2 different locations. Sometimes it walks a perimeter at midnight in a language that the men holding the torches cannot read. And it says what it says, and the soil holds it, and the soil remembers. What do you think of this story? Do you believe we've uncovered everything? What strikes you most about what Cora Rue built, and what those 4 men refused to face? If you want more stories like this one, stories about the buried, the overlooked, the erased parts of American history that refuse to stay quiet, we'll see you in the next one.